The freezing slush in the wooden bucket had turned a murky, bruised purple, stained by the blood leaking from Orena's split knuckles. She scrubbed the coarse bristle brush against the uneven stone of the High Keep's great hall, leaning her meager weight into the motion. It wasn't enough. The bitter chill of the floor seeped through her threadbare woolen tunic, biting into her knees until they went completely numb. A hollow, agonizing cramp twisted her stomach, folding her over the wet stone. 3 days. She hadn't been given a crust of bread in 3 days. Scrub faster, wolfless filth. A heavy leather boot slammed into her ribs, sending her sprawling into the icy puddle. Orena gasped, tasting dirty water and copper. She didn't dare look up at the beta guard towering over her. As an Omega, and a defective, wolfless one at that, eye contact was a death sentence. She scrambled back to her bruised knees, her frostbitten fingers trembling so violently she could barely grip the wooden handle of her brush. She kept her head down, bowing to the absolute crushing weight of the brutal hierarchy that treated her as less than dirt. Welcome back to Werewolf Whisper Playbook. Before we dive into today's drama, let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and if you love possessive alphas and secret billionaires, don't forget to subscribe. The High Keep of the Northern Reach was a monument to cruelty, constructed of jagged black iron and dark, unyielding stone. There was no warmth here, only the smoking braziers that lined the cavernous walls, offering just enough light to cast long, monstrous shadows across the floor. Orena dragged her rag across the freezing grit. Her lungs rattled with a deep, wet cough she had been trying to suppress since the first snow fell. If the head maid heard her coughing, she would be thrown out into the blizzard to freeze. Omegas who could not work were Omegas who did not survive. Her stomach gave another violent, twisting cramp. The sheer, physical agony of starvation made the edges of her vision blur into a hazy black. She focused on the rough texture of the stone beneath her raw, chapped hands, grounding herself in the pain. Pain meant she was still alive. It was the only thing she owned. Around her, the great hall was a hive of frantic, terrified preparation. Elite alpha generals in heavy plate armor barked orders at the serving staff. Dozens of other maids darted past Orena, their faces pale, their scents reeking of sour fear. The local lord of the High Keep was pacing furiously by the raised dais, his thick fur cloak snapping behind him. They were waiting for him, the Winter King. Orena had only heard whispers of the warlord in the dark confines of the slave quarters. Alpha King Valen, a beast cursed with an aura so lethal, a magic so devastatingly cold, that lesser men simply ceased to breathe in his presence. They said his gaze was a physical weapon. They said he had slaughtered entire rebel packs without lifting a single blade, freezing their hearts in their chests simply by walking through their ranks. To Orena, he was just another terrifying master in a world built to crush girls like her. She kept her eyes glued to the dirty water, her bleeding hands moving in rhythmic circles, praying to a moon goddess who had long abandoned her that she would remain entirely invisible. Then, the temperature in the great hall plummeted. It wasn't a natural cold, it was a suffocating, unnatural freeze that sucked the oxygen straight out of the massive room. The roaring flames in the iron braziers along the walls flickered, turning a sickly, pale blue before dying out completely. The sudden shadows plunged the hall into a terrifying gloom. Orena's breath plumed in the air in thick white clouds. The puddle of dirty water beneath her knees instantly crystallized, the ice creeping up the soaked hem of her skirt. A horn blasted from the outer courtyard, a single frantic note that was cut short, as if the sentry blowing it had been struck down. Silence slammed into the great hall. The frantic scrambling of the maids ceased. The alpha generals stopped barking orders. The suffocating dread was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on Orena's spine. Boom! The massive, iron-reinforced oak doors of the great hall buckled inward. Boom! The heavy wooden beams securing the doors cracked down the middle with a deafening snap. Splinters the size of broadswords flew across the stone floor. The doors blew inward, slamming against the stone walls with a force that shook the very foundations of the keep. Through the archway strode a nightmare. Alpha King Valen. He was massive, a towering wall of muscle and dominance wrapped in heavy, dark furs that were coated in a thick layer of frost. Black spiked armor clung to his broad chest and forearms. But it wasn't his sheer size that drove the court to their knees. It was the feral, suffocating power rolling off him in visible waves of freezing mist. The air pressure dropped so violently that Orena's ears popped. The scent of him hit her a second later. Crushed pine needles, the metallic tang of ozone, and the sharp, unmistakable copper scent of fresh blood. It was a terrifying primal smell that bypassed her rational mind and struck directly at the dormant, wolfless instinct deep inside her chest. "Down!" the local lord screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Avert your eyes! Drop to the floor!" No one needed to be told twice. The absolute law of the hierarchy was brutally clear. To look upon the Winter King without permission was to invite instant, frozen death. The elite alpha generals, men who had slaughtered hundreds on the battlefield, collapsed to their knees, pressing their foreheads flat against the freezing stone. The serving maids scrambled to the ground, weeping silently, curling their bodies into tight, protective balls. Orena was already on her knees, but she flattened herself further, her cheek pressing against the agonizingly cold floor. Her body shook uncontrollably. The cold radiating from the king was unbearable, biting through her thin dress, seeking out the warmth of her blood. Heavy, slow footsteps echoed through the dead silence of the hall. Crunch, crunch. The moisture in the air was turning to frost beneath his boots. Orena squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't see him, but she could feel his exact location. The unnatural predator-prey instinct screamed at her to flee, to run, to hide, but her limbs were locked in a state of absolute paralysis. The lethal aura he projected was a living, breathing thing, wrapping around the throats of everyone in the room, threatening to snap them. He was walking down the center aisle, walking past the trembling alpha generals, walking past the groveling lord. The footsteps drew closer. The cold became a physical agony. Orena's lips cracked, bleeding sluggishly. Her breath hitched in her throat, refusing to form. She felt a strange, terrifying pressure building in her chest. A wild, frantic fluttering that she had never experienced before in her 20 years of miserable existence. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something older, a primal recognition tearing at the seams of her soul. The footsteps stopped. They stopped right beside her head. Orena's eyes snapped open in sheer panic. Less than a foot from her frostbitten, bleeding fingers were two massive boots, the black leather rimmed with jagged ice. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the silence of the hall, a sound so deep and possessive it vibrated through the stone floor and rattled Orena's teeth in her skull. The Winter King had stopped for a starving maid. The black leather of his boots was close enough that the jagged frost clinging to the soles bit into Orena's split knuckles. The deep, rumbling growl emanating from the Winter King's massive chest didn't just fill the great hall, it sank into the very marrow of her bones. It was a terrifying, territorial sound that vibrated against the wet stone floor. Around her, the sheer panic of the high keep was a foul, palpable stench in the air, souring the smell of the extinguished braziers. The local alpha lord was weeping softly into the dirt. The elite generals, men who had waded through blood and severed limbs on countless battlefields, were pressing their faces so hard against the frozen floor that their skin tore. Everyone was waiting for the snap of a neck, the wet tear of flesh, the brutal punishment for whatever offense this miserable wolfless Omega had committed, simply by existing in the monster's path. Orena's body was shutting down. The cold radiating from the Alpha King was absolute. It felt like plunging headfirst into a frozen mountain lake, the sharp, paralyzing shock that drove the oxygen from her lungs and turned her blood to sludge. Her threadbare gray tunic, soaked with dirty mop water, offered zero protection against a cold this ancient. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clattered against each other, a humiliating, uncontrollable sound in the dead, suffocating silence of the hall. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, waiting for a massive, armored hand to grip the back of her neck and end her 3 days of agonizing starvation. But the strike didn't come. Instead, the suffocating scent of the beast wrapped around her, heavy and thick. Crushed pine needles, the metallic tang of an approaching winter storm, and the sharp, unmistakable copper scent of fresh blood. But beneath the lethal warning of the predator, the scent carried a strange, heavy blanket of heat. It felt protective, primal. The absolute hierarchy of the Northern Reach demanded one thing above all else. A wolfless Omega must never look an alpha in the eye. To look upon the Winter King without his express permission was an invitation for a slow, agonizing death. But the hollow cramp in Orena's empty stomach, the bone-deep ache of the creeping frost, and that strange, frantic pulling in her own chest drove her to do the unthinkable. Her eyelashes were crusted with white ice. She forced them apart. She didn't look at his boots. She didn't look at the jagged black armor that made his massive frame look like a walking fortress of iron. She tilted her chin up, the muscles in her neck straining against the cold, and looked directly into the face of the nightmare. Alpha King Valen was a god of war carved from merciless, unforgiving stone. His jaw was a harsh line, shadowed by dark scruff and set in a snarl that exposed the tips of his elongated canines. A pale, jagged scar slashed down over his left eye, a testament to a violence she couldn't even begin to fathom. But it was his eyes that stole the last ragged breath from her lungs. They were a startling luminescent silver, and they were locked entirely on her. The world expected a beast. The generals bleeding on the floor expected a butcher who would turn the keep into a slaughterhouse. But as Orena stared up into those glowing silver irises, her wolfless, deeply empathetic heart saw something completely different. She saw a man who was drowning in an eternity of ice. Behind the lethal aura, behind the terrifying, suffocating power that brought entire armies to their knees, was a profound, crushing isolation. The cold radiating from him wasn't just a weapon to be wielded, it was a curse. It was eating him alive from the inside out. She could see it in the rigid, unnatural tension of his massive shoulders, in the tight lines of agony pulling at the corners of his eyes, and the way his chest heaved, as if every breath was a battle against the winter in his own veins. He was freezing to death in plain sight, and everyone was too terrified to notice. The silence in the hall was strung so tight, it felt like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. The local lord finally dared to raise his head an inch from the frost-covered stone. "My king," the lord stammered, his voice a pathetic, watery squeak. "I apologize for the filth. I will have the guards remove the defective runt and end her miserable." Valen's head snapped toward the lord. The silver in his eyes flared to a blinding, terrifying amber. A roar ripped through the great hall, so vicious, so deafeningly loud, that the remaining iron braziers near the dais tipped over, crashing heavily against the stone floor. The sound was pure, feral violence. The lord scrambled backward on his hands and knees, whimpering like a beaten pup, throwing his arms over his head to shield himself from the impending strike. Valen turned his blazing amber eyes back down to Orena. His massive chest heaved violently beneath his spiked armor. The frost in the air thickened, the temperature plummeting even further as his inner beast fought whatever feral instinct had anchored him to this spot. He loomed over her, a massive shadow of pure, unadulterated dominance, ready to consume anything that dared to breathe his air. Orena didn't flinch. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by an overwhelming, tragic sorrow for the giant standing above her. She didn't care about the brutal hierarchy. She didn't care about the trembling alpha generals, the groveling lord, or the cruel head maid who would surely beat her to death with a fire iron for this. Her lips were cracked, a sluggish trail of blood freezing as it ran down her chin. Her voice had not been used above a raspy whisper in 10 long, miserable years. Orena pushed herself up. She lifted her frail torso off the freezing puddle, her bleeding, frostbitten hands shaking violently as she rested them on her knees to steady herself. She looked directly into his glowing amber eyes, taking the absolute, unyielding rule of their brutal world and shattering it like cheap glass. "My lord," she whispered. The sound was frail, broken, a dry rasp against the frozen air, yet it carried through the dead silence of the great hall like a ringing bell. "Are you cold?" For one agonizing heartbeat, the world simply stopped. The high keep held its breath. The elite warriors squeezed their eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable fountain of blood. An Omega had spoken out of turn. An Omega had looked the Winter King in the eye and addressed him. She was dead. She was already dead. But Alpha King Valen didn't strike. He froze. Every massive, corded muscle in his towering body locked into absolute, rigid stillness. The terrifying amber of his eyes widened, the dark pupils blowing wide until they swallowed the glowing irises, turning his eyes into bottomless pits of feral, consuming obsession. Then, the ancient magic of the bond snapped. It was a physical, visceral sound in the heavy air, like the violent cracking of a massive glacier giving way. The suffocating, lethal cold that had plunged the hall into a winter nightmare suddenly broke. The heavy layer of white frost coating Valen's dark armor began to weep. Thick droplets of water ran down the black iron, splashing onto the stone floor. The ice was melting. The terrifying warlord, the beast who commanded the entire northern continent with an iron fist, let out a ragged, shuddering breath that sounded dangerously like a sob. Right in front of his elite alpha generals. Right in front of the stunned, horrified local lord, who was still cowering in the dirt. The Winter King dropped to his knees. The heavy impact of his armored knees against the stone cracked the floor tiles beneath him. He was still massive, still a towering giant even kneeling in the dirty puddle before her, but the lethal threat was completely gone. His massive, scarred hands reached up to his own broad shoulders. With a frantic, desperate pull, he tore the heavy, dark dire wolf fur cloak from his own back. The heavy metal clasp snapped, the silver chain breaking under his sheer, panicked strength. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The heat of his massive body suddenly washed over Orena's freezing skin like an open hearth fire. He wrapped the enormous, heavy fur cloak completely around her frail, shivering shoulders. He pulled the thick, soft collar all the way up to her chin, his extraordinarily large, calloused fingers brushing against her icy cheek with a painstaking gentleness that defied all reason and logic. "Mine," Valen rumbled. The single word wasn't a command directed at the terrified room. It was a guttural, desperate prayer, vibrating straight into Orena's hollow chest. The overwhelming scent of pine, ozone, and heat wrapped around her, drowning out the misery, the pain, and the cruelty of the keep. For the first time in her entire miserable life, wrapped tightly in the warmth of the most dangerous predator in the world, the starving maid stopped shivering. Orena didn't move. She couldn't. Her entire body was locked in a state of suspended animation, terrified that if she so much as twitched, the fragile illusion of warmth would shatter. The heavy fur cloak smelled overwhelmingly of him, a potent, dizzying blend of wild pine, ozone, and that sharp metallic tang of danger. It was the scent of a predator, yet wrapped around her thin, freezing frame, it felt entirely like a shield. He was still kneeling in the dirty puddle of melted ice, his massive hands lingering at the collar of the cloak, resting just inches from her throat. His glowing amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they swallowed the color, turning his gaze into two bottomless pits of feral obsession. The silence in the hall stretched, tight as a bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. "My king!" The voice cracked like a whip across the dead air. The local lord had finally scrambled to his feet, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He gestured wildly toward Orena, his hand shaking. "My king, she is a defective, a wolfless runt. It is a crime for her to speak to you, let alone—" Valen didn't turn his head. He didn't shift his gaze from Orena. He simply let out a low, guttural snarl that rattled the remaining braziers. The sound wasn't loud, but the lethal promise behind it hit the lord with the force of a physical blow. The man dropped to his knees again, slamming his forehead against the damp stone, whimpering in terror. Valen slowly stood up. The movement was entirely fluid, a terrifying display of controlled power. Unfurling his massive frame, he towered over Orena once more, the dark, spiked armor of his chest rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. Without the heavy outer cloak, he looked even more dangerous, a warlord stripped down for battle. Yet, the paralyzing cold that had choked the hall only moments ago was gone. The air felt thin and charged, crackling with an entirely different kind of electricity. He reached down. Orena flinched, her eyes squeezing shut. She braced for the impact, for the punishing blow that would surely follow this impossible lapse in the hierarchy. Instead, an impossibly large, calloused hand wrapped gently around her upper arm. His grip was firm, unyielding, but lacking any trace of cruelty. Before Orena could process the touch, she was lifted effortlessly from the floor. Her feet left the ground, her worn leather boots dangling inches above the dirty puddle. Valen didn't just help her up. He hauled her against his chest, tucking her slight form into the crook of his arm as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. The entire court gasped in unison, a collective sound of sheer, unadulterated horror. An Alpha King did not touch an Omega. An Alpha King certainly did not lift a filthy, starving, wolfless maid from the floor and hold her against his armor in front of his elite generals and the ruling lord. It was a violation of every law, every tradition, every rigid rule that kept their brutal society functioning. "Guards!" The lord shrieked, his terror finally overriding his self-preservation. She has bewitched him. The runt is using dark magic. Kill her. Protect the king. Half a dozen beta guards, driven by instinct and the frantic command of their lord, surged forward, their swords drawn. Valen turned. The movement was a blur of violence. He didn't drop Orina. He tucked her tighter against his side, his left arm wrapping securely around her waist. With his free hand, he caught the first guard by the throat. The metallic scent of ozone spiked sharply in the air. The guard didn't even have time to scream. The freezing magic that Valen had suppressed erupted from his palm. The guard's eyes went wide, frosting over completely in a fraction of a second. The sword fell from his numb hand, clattering loudly against the stone. Valen shoved the frozen man backward, sending him crashing into the other guards, bringing them all down in a tangled heap of iron and limbs. Valen let out another roar, this one so devastatingly loud it shook dust from the vaulted ceiling. The amber in his eyes blazed with a terrifying, consuming light. "Anyone else?" he snarled, his voice a dark, booming thunder that promised absolute destruction. "Anyone else wish to tell me what to do with what is mine?" The great hall was completely silent. Even the lord, curled on the floor, didn't dare breathe. The sheer, overwhelming dominance rolling off Valen pinned them all to the stone. Orena was pressed so tightly against his chest, she could feel the frantic, thunderous beating of his heart beneath the armor. It was racing, pounding with a violent rhythm that matched the terrifying look in his eyes. He wasn't just angry, he was completely, ferociously possessive. The primal instinct of the mate bond had taken over, overriding all logic, all strategy, all diplomacy. Valen looked down at her. The lethal fury in his expression instantly vanished, replaced by a frantic, searching panic. His large hand came up, his thumb carefully brushing the freezing trail of blood from her split lip. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for her. "Did they hurt you?" Orena couldn't speak. She was trembling violently, overwhelmed by the heat of his body, the terrifying scent of his power, and the sudden, impossible reality that the most dangerous creature in the world was asking if she was hurt. She could only shake her head slowly. Valen's jaw tightened. He looked around the great hall, his gaze sweeping over the terrified maids, the cowering lord, and the elite generals who were still pressing their faces against the floor. "We are leaving," Valen announced. His voice brooked absolutely no argument. It was a command that altered the fate of the entire northern reach. "My king!" One of the alpha generals finally dared to speak, raising his head an inch from the stone. It was Commander Kale, Valen's second-in-command, a heavily scarred warrior who looked pale and shaken. "The treaty, the negotiations with the southern pacts. We cannot leave." "The treaty is dead," Valen growled, tightening his grip on Orena. "This keep is a rot on the land. If I stay here another moment, I will level it to the ground." He turned back to the ruined oak doors, his heavy boots crunching against the splinters. He didn't look back. He didn't care about the stunned silence left in his wake. He carried Orena out into the freezing courtyard, where the blizzard was still raging, the wind howling around the dark stone towers. The cold hit Orena like a physical wall, but she was cocooned in his heavy fur cloak, pressed against the overwhelming heat of his chest. Valen ignored his waiting warhorse. He ignored the carriage that had been prepared for his arrival. He carried her straight past the stunned guards, past the iron gates, and out into the biting wind of the northern reach. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair as the snow swirled around them. "You're mine. I have you." Orena buried her face against his armor, her frostbitten fingers clutching desperately at the dark fur. For 20 years, she had been a ghost, a punching bag, a miserable stain on the pack's honor, and now she was being carried away by the nightmare himself. She didn't know where he was taking her. She didn't know what this terrifying, possessive bond meant. But as the freezing wind howled and the massive Alpha King shielded her from the storm with his own body, Orena realized one impossible truth. The Winter King was the warmest thing she had ever known. The journey through the stone corridors of the High Keep was a blur of shadows and suffocating heat. Orena remained crushed against the iron-hard expanse of the Winter King's chest, her frail body entirely swallowed by the massive, frost-tipped direwolf pelt he had wrapped around her. Beneath her ear, his heart hammered a frantic, thunderous rhythm against his ribs. It was a violent sound, the heartbeat of a predator running purely on adrenaline and instinct. Valen did not take her to the dungeons. He did not hand her over to the local Alpha Lord for punishment. Instead, surrounded by a phalanx of his elite guards, who kept their weapons drawn and their eyes averted, he carried her up the winding, torchlit stairs to the royal wing, a section of the fortress strictly reserved for visiting warlords, where no lowly servant was ever permitted to tread. A heavy oak door loomed at the end of the corridor. Valen didn't bother reaching for the iron handle. He kicked the heavy wood inward with a splintering crash, carrying her over the threshold and kicking it shut behind them with the heel of his heavy boot. The heavy thud of the door sealing them inside severed all sound from the outside world. The frantic shouting of the keep, the howling of the blizzard, the clattering of armor, it all vanished, replaced by the crackle of a massive, roaring hearth fire that dominated the far wall of the chamber. Valen crossed the dark stone floor and gently deposited Orina onto the center of an enormous four-poster bed. The mattress was piled high with thick, dark furs and velvet blankets. To a body that had known nothing but freezing mud and rotting straw for 2 decades, the sheer softness of it was overwhelming. Orina scrambled backward the moment his hands left her, her spine hitting the heavy carved headboard. She pulled her trembling knees to her chest, drawing his heavy cloak tighter around her thin shoulders. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. Omegas were property. Defective, wolfless omegas were less than that. They were meat. She had broken the absolute law of the hierarchy. She had looked a royal alpha in the eye and spoken to him. The terrifying predator pacing before the hearth was not going to save her. He was going to consume her. Valen turned his back to her, gripping the thick stone mantle of the fireplace with both hands. His massive shoulders heaved as he fought a violent internal war. The lethal, freezing aura that usually surrounded him was completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, blistering heat that baked the air in the room. The scent of him was overwhelming. Crushed pine, the sharp metallic tang of a thunderstorm, and the dark, heavy spice of an alpha deeply entrenched in the primal throes of the mate bond. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound of pure agony and restraint. He was fighting his own beast. Orina could see the terrifying tremors racking his massive frame. His wolf was screaming at him to drag her into the furs, to bite down on her scent gland, to claim her so deeply and permanently that the entire continent would smell his mark on her skin. But the man knew that if he unleashed that feral dominance on a fragile, starving maid, he would terrify her to death. Valen let out a ragged curse. His large hands moved to his chest, his thick fingers frantically unbuckling the heavy leather straps of his dark armor. The iron plates hit the stone floor with a series of deafening clatters. He stripped off his heavy gauntlets, his thick wool tunic, his weapons belt, until he stood before the fire in nothing but his dark trousers and a thin, sweat-soaked linen undershirt that clung to the heavily corded muscles of his back and chest. Orina squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the violence. But as the blistering heat of the hearth washed over her freezing body, a different kind of agony set in. Her hands. The severe frostbite in her fingers was beginning to thaw. As the frozen blood vessels forcefully expanded to let the warm blood return to her extremities, the pain was excruciating. It felt as though 1,000 red-hot needles were being driven directly under her fingernails. Orina bit down hard on her cracked lip, tasting fresh copper, refusing to make a sound. A slave did not cry out. A slave suffered in silence. But the agony was so sharp, so unrelenting, that a single betrayed whimper slipped through her teeth. Valen's head snapped toward the bed. His eyes were glowing a bright, terrifying amber. The silver was completely gone, swallowed by the predatory light of his inner wolf. In a fraction of a second, he was at the edge of the bed. Orina flinched violently, throwing her arms over her head to shield herself from the blow. "Don't," Valen rasped. His voice was a harsh, gravelly scrape that sounded like stones grinding together. "Don't hide from me. I will not strike you." He slowly sank to his knees beside the mattress, deliberately making his towering, massive frame as small as he possibly could. The mattress dipped under his weight as he reached out with agonizing slowness. He didn't grab her. He waited until she slowly, fearfully lowered her arms, peering at him through her matted, dirty hair. Gently, with a care that seemed entirely impossible for a warlord whose hands had broken the necks of enemy generals, Valen took her trembling purple hands in his own. His palms were enormous, calloused from years of wielding broadswords, yet they cradled her bleeding knuckles like they were made of the finest, most fragile spun glass. "The thaw is a vicious thing," he murmured, his amber eyes dropping to her battered skin. His thumb lightly traced the swollen joint of her wrist, sending a jolt of primal heat straight up her arm. "But you must let the blood return, little bird. Let it burn. It means the flesh will live." Orina stared at his bowed head, her heart hammering against her hollow ribs. He was not looking at her with disgust. He was not demanding her obedience. He was simply holding her ruined hands, using the immense, radiating heat of his own body to carefully coax the frostbite from her bones. After a long moment, Valen gently set her hands on the soft furs. He stood, moving toward the hearth where a heavy iron pot hung over the flames, bubbling with a thick, rich stew the keep's servants had prepared for his arrival. Orena's stomach cramped so violently at the smell of roasted meat and root vegetables that she nearly doubled over. 3 days. The hunger was a hollow, scraping cavern inside her. Valen did not bring her a plate of heavy meat. He knew what starvation did to a fragile body. Instead, he dipped a wooden bowl into the pot, carefully skimming only the clear, rich broth from the top. He carried the steaming bowl back to the bed and sat on the edge, the heat of his thigh pressing through the furs against her hip. He held a wooden spoon to her cracked lips. "Eat," he commanded softly. Orania hesitated, her wide, fearful eyes darting from the wooden spoon to his intensely focused face. She reached up with her trembling, bandaged hands to take the bowl from him, assuming he wanted her to feed herself. Valen pulled the bowl back an inch. A low, possessive rumble vibrated in his throat. "Your hands are ruined. Let me." The absolute dominance in his tone left no room for argument, yet it was wrapped in a suffocating layer of protection. Orina parted her lips. Valen tipped the spoon, letting the warm, savory broth slide over her tongue. The sensation of hot, nourishing food hitting her empty, freezing stomach was euphoric. A pathetic, ragged sigh escaped her throat. She closed her eyes, leaning slightly forward to take the next spoonful he offered. For the next 10 minutes, the terrifying Winter King, the northern warlord who brought entire packs to their knees with a single glance, sat in complete silence on the edge of a bed, painstakingly hand-feeding a wolfless omega. He watched her swallow every drop, his glowing amber eyes tracking the subtle return of color to her hollow cheeks. When the bowl was finally empty, Valen set it on the floor. He reached up, his rough knuckles brushing a stray lock of dirty hair away from her forehead. "You asked me if I was cold," Valen whispered into the quiet heat of the room, his thumb lingering against her jawline. The primal, feral tension rolling off his skin made the air feel thick, heavy, and intoxicating. "For 10 years, my blood has been nothing but ice. But looking at you, I feel like I am burning alive." The heavy iron pot bubbled softly over the hearth, the rich scent of marrow and root vegetables filling the cavernous bedchamber. For the first time in her memory, Orina's stomach was not a hollow, scraping cavern of agonizing pain. She sat swathed in the Winter King's massive, dark, dire wolf furs, the lingering heat of his hands still burning against her thawing skin. The excruciating sting in her frostbitten fingers had finally ebbed to a dull, pulsing throb. Valen stood by the fire, his back to her. The sheer size of him in the flickering light was staggering. The dark linen of his undershirt clung to the heavy, scarred musculature of his back, shifting with every deep, controlled breath he took. The air in the room was thick, practically humming with the feral, possessive tension of his inner beast. The scent of pine and ozone wrapped around Orina, a heavy blanket that demanded she yield to its protection. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. Orina pulled the fur cloak tighter around her chin, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She was a wolfless omega, a slave. She did not belong in a king's bedchamber, wrapped in his scent, eating his food. The absolute hierarchy dictated she should be dead on the freezing courtyard stones. The fragile illusion of safety shattered with the echoing thud of heavy boots marching down the stone corridor. The noise grew louder, accompanied by the sharp clanking of iron armor and the harsh, panicked voices of men. Orena flinched violently, instinctively pulling her knees tightly to her chest. The ingrained terror of 20 years seized her throat, making it impossible to breathe. They were coming for her. "My king," a voice shouted from the other side of the heavy oak door. It was the local alpha lord of the High Keep, his tone a precarious mix of sheer terror and arrogant entitlement. "My king, I must protest. This is a violation of the old laws." Valen's head snapped toward the door. The low, guttural snarl that ripped from his throat vibrated against the stone floor, rattling the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. The blistering heat in the room vanished in a single heartbeat, replaced instantly by the suffocating, unnatural cold of his lethal aura. "Open the door, Kale," Valen growled. His voice was a dark, hollow promise of absolute violence. The heavy wood swung open, held by Valen's towering second-in-command. The local lord stood in the threshold, flanked by 4 heavily armored beta guards. The lord's face was pale, his breath misting in the sudden, drastic drop in temperature, but his jaw was set with the rigid stubbornness of a man who believed the ancient hierarchy protected him from the monster standing by the fire. In his thick, gloved hands, the lord held an object that made Orina's blood turn to solid ice. It was a heavy, rusted iron collar, attached to a 2-foot length of heavy chain, the obedience collar. It was the very same one she had been forced to wear as a child, its jagged edges designed to bite into the soft flesh of the throat if the wearer dared to raise their head or speak out of turn. "She is property of the High Keep," the lord stammered, his eyes darting to Orina huddled on the massive bed, before snapping back to the imposing wall of muscle that was the Winter King. "A defective wolfless Omega. By the ancient rights of the Northern Reach, a visiting alpha may not confiscate the livestock or slaves of the hosting pack without blood trade. You have broken the treaty. I demand she be collared and returned to the lower dungeons at once." The silence that followed the lord's demand was not empty. It was the terrifying, pressurized silence that precedes a devastating avalanche. Valen did not speak. He did not argue the law. He simply let his beast loose. The silver in his eyes flared, consumed instantly by a blinding, feral amber. A wave of pure, concentrated dominance blasted from his massive frame, striking the men in the doorway with the physical force of a battering ram. The 4 beta guards collapsed to their knees instantly, their hands flying to their throats as they gasped for air that was no longer there. The stone beneath Valen's heavy boots cracked, spiderwebbing outward from the sheer weight of his fury. Orana choked on a gasp as the scent of ozone and copper flooded the room, sharp and metallic. Valen took a slow, deliberate step toward the lord, his hands curled into massive fists. He was going to slaughter them. He was going to tear the lord's head from his shoulders, rip the guards apart barehanded, and burn the High Keep to the ground. The violence radiating from him was absolute and unstoppable. The lord dropped the iron collar. It hit the stone floor with a heavy, sickening clang. He fell backward, scrambling desperately on his hands and knees, whimpering as the freezing aura began to frost over his armor. "Valen," the name slipped from Orana's cracked lips before she could stop it. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be the catalyst for a massacre. She had spent her entire life trying to survive the brutality of this world. She would not let the only man who had ever shown her mercy become a butcher for her sake. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden in the furs, to remain invisible. But the profound empathy that had driven her to look into the monster's eyes in the great hall propelled her forward now. Orana pushed the heavy pelt away. Her bare feet hit the freezing stone. Her legs trembled violently, weakened by starvation and terror, but she forced herself to stand. The coarse gray wool of her damp, tattered tunic hung loosely over her frail frame as she walked past the roaring hearth, stepping directly into the path of the terrifying Alpha King. Valen stopped instantly. The amber in his eyes was wild, entirely consumed by the feral urge to destroy the threat to his mate. His massive chest heaved, a low, warning rumble vibrating from his throat as she stepped between him and the cowering lord. The tension was thick enough to choke on. One wrong move, one sudden noise, and the beast would bypass her to tear the men apart. Orana didn't look at the lord. She didn't look at the guards gasping on the floor. She slowly crouched down, her battered, raw fingers closing around the cold iron of the obedience collar. The metal was heavy, stained with old rust and dark memories of a childhood spent chained in the dark. She stood up, the thick iron chain clinking softly in the dead quiet of the room. She turned to face Valen, her heart hammered against her hollow ribs, but her hand was remarkably steady. She walked to the massive stone fireplace. With a quiet, resolute breath, Orena tossed the heavy iron collar directly into the roaring flames. The iron clattered against the burning logs, sending a shower of bright orange embers spiraling into the air. The heavy metal immediately began to blacken and heat in the blistering fire, the chains warping under the intense temperature. She turned back, her chin lifted, her empathetic eyes locking onto the feral amber of the Winter King's gaze. The absolute rule of the hierarchy lay burning in the hearth behind her. She had been invisible her whole life, bound by the chains of a society that deemed her worthless. Now, she was stripping those restraints away herself. "I am not cold anymore," Orena said softly. Her quiet voice sliced through the suffocating tension, shattering the Lord's remaining power completely. The simple, defiant truth of her words broke through the haze of Valen's bloodlust. The freezing aura gripping the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a rushing, overwhelming heat. The Alpha King closed the distance between them, in a single, desperate stride. His enormous hands gripped her waist, hauling her flush against the iron-hard muscles of his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent deeply, frantically checking that she was still real, still whole. A dark, possessive growl ripped from his throat, a sound that claimed her soul, sealing her protection against the entire world. "Never again," Valen rasped against her skin, his massive arms wrapping around her like an impenetrable fortress. "You are mine." The fortress of the Winter King was carved directly into the jagged, impenetrable obsidian ribs of the highest peak in the northern reach. Outside its massive iron-reinforced walls, a perpetual, screaming blizzard tore across the jagged mountains, burying the world in unforgiving white. But inside Valen's private chambers, the world was a sanctuary of blistering heat and suffocating safety. 2 weeks had passed since the iron obedience collar had warped and blackened in the flames. 2 weeks since the terrifying warlord had carried a starving maid out of the high keep and into the heart of his domain. Orena sat on the edge of the massive stone hearth, her bare feet resting on a thick, plush bear rug. She reached up, tentatively pressing her fingers to her own cheek. For the first time in 10 years, she could not feel the sharp, prominent edge of her cheekbone. The hollow, bruised darkness that had permanently shadowed her eyes was gone. The agonizing, scraping emptiness in her stomach had been replaced by the steady, quiet hum of a body that was finally being nourished. Her frostbitten fingers had peeled and healed, the mottled purple giving way to fresh, sensitive pink skin. She was dressed not in tattered, damp gray wool, but in one of Valen's own tunics. The dark, heavy linen engulfed her small frame, the hem falling past her knees, the sleeves rolled up half a dozen times to free her hands. It smelled overwhelmingly of him, crushed wild pine, the sharp metallic ozone of a winter storm, and that dark, heavy spice that made her pulse flutter wildly against her throat. The heavy iron latch of the chamber door clicked. Orena didn't flinch. The ingrained terror that used to seize her spine whenever a door opened had slowly, miraculously unspooled in this room. Alpha King Valen ducked his head to clear the massive stone archway. He was a towering mountain of a man, clad in dark leather trousers and a thick woolen shirt that clung to the heavy, scarred musculature of his chest. His heavy boots crunched against the stone floor, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh, melting snow from the outer battlements. The moment his boots crossed the threshold, the feral, restless energy that constantly rolled off his massive frame suddenly settled. His glowing silver eyes found her sitting by the fire, and the sheer, unfiltered possession in his gaze hit Orena like a physical weight. He didn't speak. He rarely did when he first entered the room. Instead, the Winter King crossed the heavy stone floor with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. He stopped just inches from where she sat, his towering frame casting a massive, protective shadow over her. Valen reached down, his calloused, impossibly large hands cupped her face, his thumbs gently brushing over the newly filled-out curve of her cheeks. His hands were scorching hot, a stark contrast to the freezing aura that terrified the rest of the continent. "You are warm," Valen rumbled. His voice was a dark, gravelly scrape, vibrating deep within his broad chest. It wasn't a question. It was a relieved, obsessive observation. "I am warm," Orena whispered back, her voice no longer a broken rasp, but soft and clear in the quiet heat of the room. Valen let out a long, heavy breath. He sank down onto the thick furs beside her, his massive frame taking up the majority of the hearth space. He sat close enough that the side of his heavy thigh pressed flush against her knee. The intense, primal tension between them was a living, breathing entity in the chamber. Time seemed to drag to a suffocating crawl whenever he was this close. The sheer physical dominance of the man was overwhelming, yet he held himself with such agonizing, deliberate restraint around her, terrified that his inner beast might overwhelm her fragile senses. They sat in the quiet crackle of the fire for a long time. Orina watched the orange flames reflect in the dark polish of his heavy leather boots. She had spent 20 years shrinking away from the world, desperate to remain entirely invisible to the cruel alphas who ruled it. Yet now, sitting beside the most lethal warlord in history, she felt a profound, unshakable peace. "They called you a demon," Valen said suddenly, his deep voice breaking the heavy silence. He was staring into the fire, his jaw tight. "The reports from the High Keep, after I took you. The Lord told my generals that you were a dark witch, that you used a foul magic to survive my gaze, to bewitch my wolf, and force me to my knees." Orena's breath caught in her throat. She pulled her hands into her lap, her fingers twisting nervously into the thick linen of his tunic. "I have no magic," she said softly. "I do not even have a wolf. I am defective, wolfless." Valen's head snapped toward her. The silver in his eyes flared dangerously, a flash of pure, territorial amber bleeding into the irises. "Never say that word," he growled, the sheer force of his command vibrating against the stone walls. "You are not defective, you are mine." He turned his body toward her, one heavy arm resting on his knee, bringing his scarred, hardened face level with hers. The lethal tension in his massive shoulders was painfully visible. "Do you know why my aura froze them, Orena?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "Do you know why the generals bled from their eyes and the lords stopped breathing when I walked into a room?" Orena shook her head slowly, mesmerized by the raw, bleeding vulnerability in the monster's eyes. "Because my power is absolute," Valen stating a simple, brutal fact. "It is ancient, and it is heavy, but it is entirely tied to the soul of the wolf who wields it. For 10 years, I sat on the obsidian throne, I commanded armies, I slaughtered rebellions, and for 10 years I was completely, agonizingly alone." He reached out, his massive fingers lightly tracing the delicate line of her collarbone, a touch so painstakingly gentle, it made Orena's heart ache. "They looked at me, and they saw a god of winter," Valen continued, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken suffering. "They saw a butcher, a warlord, a beast to be feared and obeyed. They bowed their heads, they averted their eyes, and they prayed I would not strike them dead. The isolation, it was a physical rot in my blood. The colder my heart grew, the more lethal my aura became. I was freezing to death from the inside out, trapped in a cage of my own power, and no one noticed." No one dared to look past the monster to see the man. Valen's hand dropped from her collarbone, his broad chest heaving as he fought the dark memories. "Until you," he whispered, his glowing eyes locked onto hers with a desperate, all-consuming devotion. "A starving, beaten maid on a freezing stone floor. You were dying. You were in agony, and yet you looked up. You looked the Winter King directly in the eye, and your only concern was whether or not I was suffering." The profound weight of his confession hung in the blistering heat of the chamber. Orena's chest tightened, a fierce, protective emotion rising in the hollow space where her fear used to live. Slowly, she unclasped her hands from her lap. She didn't bow her head. She didn't shrink away from his massive, intimidating frame. Orena reached up, her small, newly healed fingers pressing gently against the harsh, stubble-covered line of his jaw. Valen froze. His breath hitched violently in his throat. She dragged her thumb upward, tracing the thick, jagged scar that slashed violently over his left eye. The skin was rough, a testament to unimaginable violence, but beneath her touch, she felt the frantic, heavy pounding of his pulse. A low, guttural rumble tore from Valen's chest. It was a feral sound, entirely primal, devoid of all logic or royal decorum. His massive hands moved, gripping her waist and hauling her effortlessly across the few inches that separated them. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face into the crook of her neck. Orena wrapped her arms around his thick neck, her fingers tangling in the dark, heavy strands of his hair. She squeezed her eyes shut as the overwhelming heat of his body and the potent scent of pine and ozone enveloped her completely. The brutal world outside these walls dictated that Omegas were slaves and Alpha Kings were untouchable gods. But as Orina held the trembling, massive beast in her arms, feeling the lethal Winter King yield entirely to her gentle touch, she realized the absolute truth. The most dangerous creature in the world was the only place she had ever been safe. Yes, I am ready. Here is the final chapter of our story. Chapter 6. The Setup Shattered. The morning of the winter solstice dawned with a sky the color of hammered steel. Throughout the northern reach, the bells of the great citadels tolled, their heavy rhythmic iron clanging echoing through the deep mountain passes. This was the day that decided the fate of the realm. According to the ancient, rigid laws of the Iron Keep, the Winter King had to sit upon the obsidian throne to judge the territorial disputes of his realm. But it was also a day of judgment for the king himself. If he sat alone, without a consort capable of withstanding his freezing, lethal aura, the high priests held the authority to declare his line broken and force him to relinquish his crown to the next strongest alpha. Valen stood in the center of his private chambers, his massive, corded back to the room. He was adjusting the clasp of his heavy, ceremonial dark velvet mantle, his movements stiff and controlled. Behind him, Orena stood by the vanity. She was dressed in a gown of deep, midnight blue velvet, the heavy fabric skimming over her frame, which was now healthy and strong. Her dark hair was braided with thin, silver filaments that caught the firelight. Her face was clean, serene, and devoid of the terror that had defined her existence for 20 years. Valen turned. His silver eyes, usually so sharp and predatory, softened the moment they landed on her. The heavy, lethal chill that had defined his entire reign was absent, replaced by a steady, pulsing warmth that he only ever felt in her presence. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his large hands coming up to cup her face. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her was a vow, a silent, fierce promise that the day ahead, for all its political venom and ritualized judgment, was merely a precursor to the life they were building together. "They will expect you to stay behind, Orena," Valen murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that resonated through the quiet room. "The high priests and the gathered lords, they will look for any excuse to invalidate us. They have waited centuries for a Winter King to falter. They have spent weeks plotting to replace me with a puppet they can control." Orena reached up, her fingers lightly brushing against the back of his hand. "Let them plot," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The hierarchy they worship is a hollow, frozen thing, Valen. It has no power here. Not anymore." Valen leaned his forehead against hers. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the crackling of the hearth and the shared rhythm of their heartbeats. Then, he took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and led her toward the heavy, iron-bound doors. The great hall of the Iron Keep was filled with the reek of damp wool, fear, and cold ambition. Hundreds of nobles, generals, and pack leaders stood in the cavernous, vaulted space, their faces illuminated by the flickering, low-burning torches. When the massive doors groaned open, a sudden, suffocating silence fell over the assembly. Valen strode forward, his pace deliberate and heavy. But it was the figure beside him that stopped every heart in the room. Orena walked with her head held high, her eyes fixed forward, her hand firmly gripped in the Winter King's. As they passed, the high-ranking lords recoiled as if they had been struck. Whispers erupted, vicious, scandalized, frantic. "Is that the slave? The wolfless girl from the courtyard? He brings a maid to the obsidian throne?" Valen ignored them all. His gaze remained locked on the dais ahead, where the ancient, jagged obsidian throne sat in the center of the hall, carved from a single dark stone that seemed to swallow the light. The high priest, a man draped in heavy ceremonial furs and bone jewelry, stepped forward, his expression a mask of frozen disapproval. "My king," the priest intoned, his voice echoing against the cold stone. "The laws of the winter solstice are absolute. The throne is reserved for the king and his high-born consort. To place a commoner, a wolfless outcast, upon the sacred stone is to invite the wrath of the ancestors. Withdraw this insult, or the council will be forced to move for a vote of succession." Hall erupted into a chaotic, mutinous clamor. The lord of the High Keep, the man who had tried to collar Orena, surged to the front, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Succession. We will not be ruled by a king who has lost his mind to a slave. Valen stopped at the base of the dais. He didn't look at the high priest. He didn't look at the mutinous lord. He turned to Orina. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look for permission from the council or the ancient, rotting laws of the realm. Valen simply lifted Orina effortlessly in his arms, her midnight blue velvet dress swirling around them like a dark storm cloud. With a single, fluid motion, he stepped up the dais and moved to the obsidian throne. The high priest shrieked, "Stop!" Valen ignored him. He reached the throne and sat, but he didn't lean back. He shifted, adjusting his position, and then he sat Orina down on the seat beside him. The entire hall collectively gasped. The sound was like a sharp intake of air in a tomb. Valen did not sit alone. He did not leave the space beside him empty. He held her hand, resting it firmly on the dark, ancient stone of the throne's arm. Then, in front of the entire assembly, in front of the high priests, the treacherous lords, and the terrified soldiers, the most powerful, feared warlord in the history of the Northern Reach did the one thing that broke the hierarchy forever. Valen slid from the throne, his massive frame descending to the cold stone at Orina's feet. He didn't just kneel, he bowed his head completely, pressing his forehead against the stone before the woman who had once scrubbed it with bleeding fingers. He took her hand, the one that had brushed the frost from his own scarred cheek, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "My queen," Valen growled, his voice carrying through the hall, rich with a devotion that silenced every single protest. The high priest opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The mutinous lord took a step forward, but his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor as Valen's terrifying feral aura returned, not as a weapon of ice, but as a suffocating protective barrier that dared anyone to challenge her. Orina sat on the throne, her spine straight, her heart filled with a quiet, devastating strength. She looked out over the assembly, the people who had treated her as nothing, the hierarchy that had demanded she be broken, and she felt nothing but pity. She looked down at the King of the North, the man who had been a nightmare to all, now kneeling in complete, voluntary submission to her. She reached down, her soft, healed fingers cupping his face, and pulled him up. As he rose, Valen didn't take the throne again. He stood beside her, his hand never leaving her waist, his presence a living, breathing wall of protection. The setup was shattered, the rules were rewritten. The Winter King no longer ruled through fear, and the wolfless maid was no longer a slave. They stood together, the king and his queen, their shadows cast long and dark across the obsidian floor, a testament to the truth that the most powerful magic of all was not power, or gold, or bloodline. It was love, chosen freely, and defended with everything they had. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf let out a long, haunting howl that was answered by hundreds of others, a chorus of voices ringing out across the frozen mountains. The era of ice had ended. The era of the queen had begun. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed Orina and Valen's journey from the freezing courtyard to the obsidian throne. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I read every single one of them. Until next time, stay wild and keep listening.